Go ahead and read problem 7-73. So in this problem, we're trying to find missing parts of these shapes. Now, one very important point in the directions that might not be clear is that you need to first prove whether or not the triangles are congruent. You might want to go ahead and jump in thinking you can find X without doing that. But if you do, and the triangles are not necessarily congruent, your answer, although it might look correct, wouldn't be justifiable. So make sure you first prove whether or not those triangles are congruent.
Hey, I want to encourage you to do as much of this problem as you can on your own and only use the video where you need it. If you just watch the video and watch me do the problem and expect to learn that way, that would kind of be like trying to learn how to drive a car by sitting in the passenger seat and watching me drive the whole time. You're not going to learn much that way. The only way really to learn how to drive is to get in the driver's seat yourself and control the car. Same with these videos. To learn math, you need to do the math, okay? So I encourage you to pause the video and try and do as much as you can on your own. And then when you need help, hit play and I'll be there to provide steps. I want you to learn as much as you can in this process, all right? So do as much driving as you can and you're going to learn if you follow it that way. Good luck.
Let's begin. Letter A. So first we need to see whether or not these triangles are congruent. Before I do that, I'm going to write out all of the triangle congruence theorems for us to reference. So we have side angle side congruence, side 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 congruence, angle side angle congruence, angle angle side congruence, and then the often forgotten hypotenuse leg congruence that works only for right triangles. For letter A, do we have enough information to prove that those two triangles on either side, here and here, are congruent? Well, let's look at what we have. We have a pair of congruent sides here. We know that this side here is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. And then they also give us this right angle. We can conclude that since this is a straight line segment and that this must be 180, that this would also be 90 to equal 180. So there we have enough information to say that these two triangles are congruent using side angle side. We have side angle side. So instead of just writing side angle side, let's write an actual triangle congruent statement. We'll say triangle AB. Now we don't have this point right here, so I'm going to add a point here, D. Triangle ABD is congruent to triangle what? Now remember, these congruent statements need to be written in order of corresponding parts. So you try and finish that congruent statement. Hopefully you put triangle CBD. All right, and we'll say by SAS congruence. Excellent. Now that I know those two triangles are congruent, I can go ahead and find X. So here we have, as you see, a right triangle. And you may be thinking, well, since it's a right triangle, I can use the Pythagorean theorem. So since this is the same as this, I'm just going to call that X. So I could say X squared plus 8 squared equals 10 squared and solve for X. That will work. However, if you notice, there's also another quicker way we can use here. If you look at 8 and 10, that gives us a hint that this is a 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triple with a scale factor of 2. So we see 5 times 2 is 10, 4 times 2 is 8, and so 3 times 2 is our missing side x, 6. So x equals 6. Okay, go ahead and give B a shot. All right, for letter B, you may want to say, oh, easy. 10 and x are congruent, and so x equals 10. Now, that might be the right answer, but we can't justifiably say that right now because we don't know whether or not those two sides are congruent. We first need to prove that the triangles are congruent. If we can, then we can say that x is 10. So let's look and see what we have. We have a pair of congruent angles that's given. We have this side in the middle that's congruent to itself by the reflexive property. But what else do we have? We can't say that these sides are congruent because we don't know what x is. But they give us these parallel arrows. And so what can we conclude as a result of those two sides being parallel? Maybe you want to take a look at the linked worksheet in the description of this video, the same one you used for the previous problem. If you take a look at that, see if you can identify a pair of angles that might be congruent or supplementary as a result of those two parallel lines. So either by memory or by looking at that worksheet, hopefully you identify with these two parallel lines and this transversal, we have congruent alternate interior angles. And so do we have enough to say that the triangles are congruent? Let's look. We have a pair of angles. We have a congruent pair of sides in between them, shared side, and then another pair of angles. And so that meets the requirement for angle-side angle congruence. So let's now write our triangle congruence statement. Triangle A, B, D is congruent to triangle. Again, you try and finish this statement, keeping in mind that congruent statements need to be written in order of corresponding parts. So angle A corresponds with C. B corresponds with D in this triangle. And then D with B by angle, side, angle congruence. Now that we know that those two triangles are congruent, I can quickly find x. We look at side AD here. And if we look at our statement, we can see side AD corresponds with side CB. And if triangles are congruent, corresponding parts are congruent, which means 10 and x are congruent, so x equals 10.
Listen, I know what you're thinking. Mr. C, I could have finished that problem in like 2 seconds. I knew x equaled 10 from the very beginning. Okay, yeah, I can see what you're saying, but could you have justified it? And that's what matters here. You might have seen, hey, x equals 10, and that ended up being the right answer. But if I asked you at that point, well, tell me why x equals 10, you would have been like, well, because. And we both know that's not a good enough answer. But now, having proven those triangles are congruent, you can say, I'll tell you why, Mr. C. I'll tell you why right now. Those two triangles are congruent by angle-side-angle congruence. And, as you know, because you are a geometry teacher, if triangles are congruent, then corresponding parts are congruent, Mr. C, and that means that tan and x are congruent sides. Boom! See, now you really understand it if you do it that way.
Now on to letter C. Again, first, let's see if we can prove whether or not the triangles are congruent. Well, what do they give us? We know that these two opposite sides are congruent. And we know that these two angles are right angles, which are congruent. And we have this shared side is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. And so here we have angle, side, side. Is that one of our congruence theorems? No, it's not. So does that mean these triangles are not congruent? No, it doesn't. It just means we have to prove it a different way if they are. Now, don't forget the often forgotten congruence theorem. We are dealing with right triangles here, and we have a hypotenuse and a pair of legs. So guess what? We can use hypotenuse leg. So let's write our congruent statement. Triangle ADC is congruent to triangle. Try and finish it. If you put ADC for the first triangle, then you would need to put CBA for the second one to keep them in order of corresponding parts. And this is by HL congruence. Now to find x. Well, since this is a rectangle by the properties of a rectangle, we know that these two sides are parallel because a rectangle is a special type of parallelogram. We did that in the previous problem. And if those sides are parallel, then we know that these are congruent alternate interior angles. So that is also 35 degrees. Now I have this right triangle. And I am going to use that to find x. All right. Do you remember how I can find x when I'm given one side and one angle of a right triangle? Pause the video and look back in your notes and see how you might find that missing side. Hopefully, you identified that we're going to use trig. And so, in this case, which sides am I dealing with? Well, I'm dealing with this opposite side. And then x is the adjacent leg. So when I'm dealing with the opposite leg and the adjacent leg, I use, if you remember, SOHCAHTOA, tangent equals opposite over adjacent. So I'm going to say tan of 35 degrees equals opposite leg 11 over adjacent leg x. Go ahead and try and solve that equation for x. All right, if we solve this, we can make this into a proportion, cross multiply, and we get tan 35 times x equals 11. Divide both sides by tan of 35. And I'm going to shrink this to give us more room. And now I'm left with x equals, after canceling those out and replacing with 1, 11 over tan of 35. Now that is the exact form of the answer, but we would like to have a number that makes sense to us. So use your calculator to figure out what tan of 35 equals. You can use a calculator on your phone or on Google. There are many resources you have available to calculate that. When you do so, you should get x is approximately 11 over, and tan of 35 is approximately 0.7. And when you divide that, you get x is approximately 15.71 units. And there's our answer. Now on to letter D. So let's first see whether or not these triangles are congruent. Give this one your best shot, okay? Pause the video. You've seen A, B, and C. Now try and do D all by yourself. Hit play when you think you have the right answer. Let's see if we can prove whether or not these triangles are congruent. Well, we have a pair of congruent angles here. That's given to us. We also know that these two angles are congruent. That's given to us. They're both 47 degrees. Now you may want to say, well, 4 and x are congruent, but we don't know that. We don't know what x is. So we cannot say that. Is there anything else we can say? Any other congruent angles? Well, you could say by the triangle angle sum theorem that these have to be congruent because they both have to add up to 180. You could also say they are congruent vertical angles. Either one is correct. Now, is that enough information to say that the triangles are congruent? We have 3 pairs of congruent angles. So that would be angle, 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 congruence. But do you see an AAA up here? No, you do not. Because there is no AAA, triangle congruence theorem. If you have 3 congruent angles, they are similar. So triangles are similar only by a similarity. But they're not congruent because one could be a dilation of another. You could have 2 completely different sized triangles, one small one and one big one, that have 3 congruent angles. So we cannot say they are congruent, and thus our answer is cannot be determined. And that's it for problem 7-73. For 7-74, you're going to do a flow chart to extend your thinking on one of these 4 problems. You should do that with your teacher, either through a Zoom call or in person. So make sure and have your work ready to extend these proofs into an organized flow chart. Good luck.